The Native American Genocide, Holocaust and Genocide Project by Annelies West. The Native American Genocide. What genocide was it? Cultural genocide is defined by the UN as any deliberate act committed with the intention of destroying the language, religion, or culture of a group, such as, for example, prohibiting the use of the group's language or its schools or places of worship. We have seen this form of genocide committed against the native and indigenous people of North America for the past 400 years. We often forget about our native people and blame their decimation on disease from the Old World, but this is not the case. Their near extinction was planned very early on when King George II began paying people for the killing of natives and is still going on today. While the Native American genocide was more focused on eliminating the Native American culture, the Holocaust was an optimal genocide, meaning that it was an attempt for the total obliteration of a race. Classification. Whites define themselves as a superior race from the minute our ancestors set up foot on this land. The racism began there and then spread through generations. Whites began classifying themselves as better than Indians, just like the Germans began classifying themselves as superior to Jews. The Indians were classified based on their darker skin color, their religious differences, and their tribal nature. North America became whites versus Indians. However, this classification began with the English and the Spanish settlers, as the French actually saw them as people and as equals or trading partners. Similarly, the Jews were different because of their religion and different appearance than the typical Aryan German. Although Jews were in fact German, they separated them out of their group. The classification of Germans can be shown in Document 3 of Sources of the Holocaust and an excerpt from Martin Luther. He said, "Dear Christian, be advised and do not doubt that next to the devil you have no more bitter, venomous, and vehement for than a real Jew who earnestly seeks to be a Jew. Therefore, the history books often accuse them of contaminating wells, of kidnapping and piercing children, as for example at Trent Wessency, etc. In this, Martin Luther is drawing a line between the German people, on one side, the honest Christian, on the other side is the enemy, or the Jews. Symbolization. The name for native people is said to have come from whites calling them Indian, because Christopher Columbus thought he landed in India when in fact he landed in the Americas. This name stuck and became the name of the people who were different from whites. The Indians also had physical characteristics to set them apart from everyone else. At the time, Native Americans had darker skin coloring and often wore a distinct style of clothing that set them apart from everyone else. The men often had long, braided hair, which was not common in Europeans. Beads and bright colors were shown throughout their clothing choices as well. While the natives had their own wardrobe and skin tone to set them apart, it was not always that easy to tell a Jew from a German. In Document 29, there was a set of decrees, and the very first rule was, "A special emblem Jews will carry, regardless of age and gender, on the right arm directly under the armpit. A 10-centimeter wide armband in a Jewish yellow color." This was a way of symbolizing who was Jewish and who was German. These rules were strongly enforced. From the quote, it is understood that natives did not need bands like the Jews, since their extremely different physical appearance and language set them apart already. Jews were harder to identify, since they had the same skin tone and spoke the same language, hence the decrees that took over Germany. Dehumanization. There were many different instances where the Indian people were seen as rivals to the white. One of which was when the Lenape Indians kidnapped a 10-year-old girl named Mary Campbell in Pennsylvania. The whites used this as a propaganda against every tribal group, calling them monsters, murderers, and, most importantly, uncivilized. The Germans also used propaganda to turn the public eye against the Jewish population. They often compared them to the devil, and warned that they are a danger to children, the economy, and the German race. Children's books were published, such as Document 16, The Poisonous Mushroom. In this book, it alludes that a Jewish doctor raped a German girl, and no German should go to a Jewish doctor unless they want to be diseased or disgraced. The book said, terrified, she jumps up, her eyes stare into the face of the Jewish doctor, and this face is the face of the devil. Instead of natives being considered the devil, they were considered uncivilized and barbaric. The natives were considered this because of their different beliefs, such as the way they hunted, the way they dressed, and the way they spoke. Lewis Cass insisted, they are barbarous people, depending for substance upon the scanty and precarious supplies furnished by the chase, and cannot live in contact with a civilized community. Andrew Jackson also argued the following in his 1833 address to Congress. They have neither the intelligence, industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement. Both countries described their enemies as also awful people, not deserving to live on the same land or even at all. Organization. The Dawes Act played a major role in the organization and location of the Native Americans' land. The act was signed into action by Henry L. Dawes in 1887. This act snatched away land from the natives that was then surveyed in order to distribute it back out to white people and natives who were willing to leave behind their tribal life and their communal land. This land could be seen as an incentive to assimilate with the whites, but in all actuality, this land was taken and then redistributed with more laws, harming and eliminating the Native American culture. It also relocated Indians in order to give them less valuable land, since they were seen as less valuable people. Since the genocide for the Native American people was so widespread and agreed upon in America, the U.S. military was the militia formed, and orders came from the U.S. leaders and generals. The Nazis also formed a militia and began dispersing troops in 1941. Document 39 described the secret orders by the First Lieutenant Walther. The place of execution was secured by 3 light machine guns and 12 riflemen, for 1, against attempts at escape, and for 2, for self-protection against any attacks by Serbian bands. Other documents explain secretly organized militia squads ordered to shoot and kill Jewish people. It seems like America's genocide was well known to the public, and even supported. People in America wanted more land for themselves, and if that meant forcibly removing it on their culture, then that was what happened. The genocide in Germany seems like it was at least attempted to be kept secret. Polarization. Moderates within the genocide against the natives included many natives who sought peace with the Americans. Many tribes signed peace treaties with the Americans, granting some land away in exchange for keeping the rest of the land. However, many tribes, like the Chickasaws, Cherokees, and the Creek Nation, were in favor of peace, yet were still pushed away or killed. Other moderates included the French, within the French and Indian War. Because they supported the natives and fought to preserve and save their land, they were killed in many battles. There were also many non-Jews killed in the Holocaust, some of which attempted to stop the genocide beginning to occur. Many members of the German churches were killed or silenced because they believed what was happening to the Jews was wrong and against Christian beliefs. This posed a threat to the Nazi cause, which was then eliminated or discredited. Other examples of polarization in the Holocaust included the expansion of targets of the Nazis to include the handicapped, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and gypsies. Many of these people sought peace, but were killed because of it. In Document 15, Heinrich Himmler described the necessity of killing people who posed a threat to the purity of the German race in the following quote: "That was not a punishment, but was simply the extinguishing of this anomalous life. It had to be removed. As we pull out stinging nettles, throw them into a pile, and burn them. There was no feeling of revenge, but the person had to be removed." Preparation. The natives lost their land to the Americans many times. First when they settled, and then constantly up until today. One major method was the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was the direct result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The act permitted whites to push the Indians into designated locations in the western parts of the country. Natives were rounded up were forced to give their names and then designated a number. This numerical system is very similar to a prison system, and even the system of Jewish ghettos with the Nazis. Indian boarding schools were established in 1860 and were established by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Natives were organized into these off-reservation boarding schools and ripped away from their families. In Germany, Jews were forced into ghettos where they had a Jewish government that acted as puppets to their German leaders. This allowed the Jewish population to be in a confined area with easy transport for later steps in the genocide. In document 27, Reinhard Heydrich wrote, "In the regions mentioned under number 2, the fewest possible concentration points should be established so that later measures will be facilitated." In both cases, the subjects were forced to uproot their families and belongings into a new nation where they were treated as prisoners. New location where they were treated as prisoners. Germany began building concentration camps during this stage, and the Americans began running places such as boarding schools. Extermination, Part 1. The extermination of Native people has happened in America throughout multiple centuries, using several different methods with the same outcome: cultural assimilation. Extermination has happened using disease in the early years of white settlement. Settlers would give Native Americans blankets intentionally infected with smallpox in order to kill them and expose them to foreign, deadly diseases. The Trail of Tears and the Long Walk of the Navajos were both deadly walks which lasted for what seemed like ages. On these walks, many of the people starved and ultimately perished. Abuse and assimilation within the boarding schools represented cultural genocide, as it killed off the native culture and those that associated with it. Richard H. Pratt was a captain in the Army and opened the first Indian boarding school. His most famous quote is, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The Indian population was no longer allowed to speak their native language or practice their religion. The indigenous peoples were also forced to get rid of physical appearances that tied them to their nativity. Boys with long braids were forced to cut their hair off into a short, more masculine-seeming trim. Both girls and boys were forced to dress more American, with standard uniforms in the schools as well. This ties in with how prisoners in concentration camps had their heads shaved and were then forced to wear striped uniforms. This picture illustrates what it's like to go through cultural assimilation. Here we can see he has long hair and is dressed in his regular native clothing, but here he looks lighter and more Americanized. Extermination, Part 2. There were countless wars against the natives. That many wars and battles against one targeted group has never happened in history. Not only were there wars, there were massacres. The Sand Creek Massacre killed men, women, and children in their sleep. Within the Wessagussa affair, native leaders were lured in and then murdered. There are countless other successful attempts at annihilating the native culture. In a book titled Better Dead Than Pregnant, the author said, "Indeed, colonizers such as Andrew Jackson recommended that troops systematically kill women and children after massacres in order to complete the extermination." Later on in the 20th century, eugenics against the Native Americans began in order to attempt to secretly end the race. An increase in abortions and accidentally sterilizing women began. Physicians would threaten the mothers that if they did not get sterilized or abort their baby, they would not receive health care and would lose custody of their children. Cultural assimilation was successful with the native people, and it has been continuing throughout generations. Extermination, Part 3. Comparison. The method of extermination against the Jews was much more direct and isolated to a more specific time. Jews were shot and killed, lethally injected, or shoved into gas chambers. Tactics used to kill the Jews seem much more extreme, but had the same outcome as the tactics used against tribes. Document 67 describes the brutal and sickening extermination against the Jews. The author wrote, "Like basalt pillars, the dead stand upright, pressed against each other in the chamber. There had been no place to fall over, or even to lean forward. Even in death, one can recognize the families. They hold each other's hands, stiffened in death, so that one has difficulty tearing them apart in order to clear the chamber for the next load. Cultural assimilation made it so not all targets died, but their culture did. Both the extermination of the native culture and the Jewish race has decimated populations, destroyed families, stole happiness, and assassinated cultures." World involvement. Other nations, including Canada, treated their indigenous people very similarly. They displaced and killed them in their quest for colonization and assimilation. However, Canada has formally apologized in front of the United Nations for their actions, while the United States is yet to do so. Private organizations, including hospitals, clinics, and schools, all agreed with our country's plan to eliminate both the culture and the lives of the indigenous people. Hospitals and clinics compelled and threatened the Native American women to get sterilized, and if they refused, the doctors would operate without consent. Schools assisted in assimilating natives into white culture and made rules regarding their culture and how they must not express it. Pleas made for help include when the Creek Indians of Georgia were attempting to stay in their land, but the governor of Georgia refused to allow that. The President of the United States at the time was John Quincy Adams, who was in favor of the natives keeping their land, and he insisted on letting the Indians stay and managed to get them a fair trade deal. Unfortunately, this was later broken. Other nations strictly ignored this issue, except for France, who fought alongside the natives in the French and Indian War, which resulted in France losing the war and many lives. Overall, there were no successful foreign attempts to save the Native Americans. The indigenous peoples of Canada were also being assimilated and murdered, leaving the Native Americans with nowhere to seek refuge in. As the natives pushed further and further west, fewer and fewer people survived. Only about 5% of the original population survives today. No other countries allowed natives to seek refuge, and even if they did, the natives did not have enough money or the equipment to sail to a new location. The UN holds those accountable for genocide and crimes against humanity. In relation to the Jewish genocide and the Holocaust, the UN developed a judicial system that tried criminals who allegedly committed genocide in a set of trials called the Nuremberg trials. They punished those according to the crimes they committed. For example, many Nazi leaders were sentenced to death. Nothing similar has been held for the Native American genocide. Trials regarding the destruction of native property have not taken place either. For example, just a few years ago, Trump signed a document which allowed a pipeline to be built through the reservations, taking more land, but no one has interfered. Denial and the future. We have learned many valuable lessons from the actions taken by our ancestors since the beginning of our stolen nation. Through many battles, we have learned that we must protect everyone and that all lives, cultures, religions, and races should be treated equally and with respect. However, we continue to ignore the genocide itself. To this day, the United States does not recognize that anything unlawful or inhumane was committed against the Native Americans. The United States is one of the few countries ignoring their indigenous genocide. Places such as Canada, Germany, New Zealand, and Australia all recognize the genocide they committed. The United States did finally intervene with the Jewish genocide after actually contributing to it by committing indifference and turning away a boatload of Jews begging for refugee. The United States was very slow compared to other countries with their intervention. Besides that occasion, the U.S. has not intervened with other genocides, including the one that is on their soil. In terms of what we can do as people, we can start by recognizing what happened. Personally, I could join peaceful protests to fight for the budget and preservation of Native American reservations. Unfortunately, they're still being threatened. I could also encourage my culture to learn more about other cultures in order to become more accepting of differences and change in our communities. Citations Part 1. Part 2 and Part 3.